broad umbrella of resisting AI, I want to talk about three things really, which is technopolitics, ecology, and decomputing. So a couple of years ago, I wrote this book, Resisting AI, an Anti-Fascist Approach to Artificial Intelligence. And that was my attempt to develop what I would call a technopolitics. So that's trying to understand AI in a way that doesn't treat any aspect, the technical or the social, or as we'll see, the environmental, as distinct things that come together, but rather to develop a critique that is sees them as co-arising aspects of essentially the same underlying, I guess, historical phenomenon. And another important part of it for me was that it wasn't just a critique. You know, there's plenty of good critiques, but I wanted to find a way to write through to the idea of alternative vision and practice and action, essentially. Let me see now. Are you seeing the second slide now? You're seeing a graph?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I can't see it. There's something weird about the presentation format, so I can't see most people, unfortunately. So thanks very much. Great. Yeah. So where are we with the technopolitics of AI? I mean, thinking about today, preparing for it a bit last week, I was really struck by the synchronicity of two, what I would call lines going up. And one of those lines was the market valuation of NVIDIA. That's the manufacturer who makes the bulk of the chips that are used for AI, the GPUs. They're currently dominant in the market, and their valuation just passed 3 trillion. So that puts them ahead of Apple. I think that makes them the second biggest, certainly the second biggest company in big tech, and possibly the biggest, most highly valued company in the world. I mean, they drove most of the stock market gains over the last year. So that's one line going up, and the other line going up is what was at that time the projected gains, which is now the actual gains of far-right political parties in the European elections. So that's the fascists in Italy and in Germany and France and in the Netherlands. You know, you get the picture. So I think, which is also given away in a way by the title of the book, that these lines are deeply connected. You know, they're connected at a fairly fundamental level, which one might even call ecological. Also last week, I noticed the chair of the ACM Conference on Fairness, Accountability and Transparency, that's FACT, which is a conference that's been happening, I think, in the last few days. That's pretty much the biggest sort of ethical, responsible AI conference around. But they had a bit of a spat because they refused to condemn the use of AI in the genocide in Gaza. And in fact, the chair of that conference said it would be better not to mix science and politics, which I thought was actually a fairly profound statement about a sort of approach to the world, essentially. Exactly the one that I feel, well, certainly I'm trying to contest when it comes to technologies. So when I wrote the book, I tried to talk about this idea of resonances, the way that the technical means and the social effects were sort of co-arising and sort of reinforced each other. And I think that's another way to talk about ecological entanglement. I mean, I didn't use that term in the book, but I think it works because it's talking about processes, it's talking about interactions, it's talking about the way they reinforce each other and adapt to each other. So in Resisting AI, I was talking about algorithmic harms. I was talking about the dead end of liberal regulation. I was talking about these philosophical roots that give AI legitimacy, which is very much to do with the science aspect, and then trying to basically invert it all to find some kind of alternative. I was particularly interested in the collateral damage from AI, from its opacity, its facility for scaling bureaucratic cruelty and institutional violence, and its tendency to steer crisis response. So, I mean, Theo's references to crisis is a really interesting there's some really interesting connections to be made, because my view of AI is that it takes whatever is being called a crisis and steers that towards a kind of, technical solutionism or technological solutionism, but particularly a necropolitical solutionism. So I wrote this book, and then about 6 months later, ChatGPT was released. So since then, very much been a process of watching these same dynamics play out in an even more florid way. You know, in an even more sort of techno-psychopathic way, I guess, over the last year or two. So losing my slides here. I think I meant to put that one up. Anyway, here we are. Why do I think of this as sort of florid and somewhat psychopathic? For example, in the UK, the absolute priority across the political parties, because there's an election going on at the moment, is a commitment to AI for the future of education. When we literally have collapsing roofs in schools, this is a picture of a school from Kent, and there's this kind of roofing called the reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, which basically means not very good concrete, as it turns out, because when it gets older, it just collapses. So this is an actual school building. It's not the only one. There's hundreds. And it's very figurative for me, because the priority, rather than sort of sorting out the basics, rather than sorting out the massively unfair distribution of resources across the country in terms of education, fixing the basics like school buildings, fixing the basics like having enough teachers and not replacing them with untrained people, and all of what is actually going on, the focus is on this magic technology that's somehow going to sort things out. And you can see the same thing playing out across different areas. In healthcare, for example, I saw in video directly involved in this, actually, this propagation of the idea of virtual nurses. So there's actually a kind of marketing campaign in the States for, replace your $90 an hour nurse with your $9 an hour nurse avatar, synthetic nurse, generative AI nurse, basically. This is, profoundly concerning for like a large number of reasons. I mean, not least of which is these systems will never do what they claim to do, because they have no capacity to deal with the ever-shifting concepts of of lived experience. I mean, Theo mentioned, the vital aspect of sort of context and particularity, and this is exactly what these systems, what they erase. So they can never deal with the world of lived experience. So they will never do the things that are claimed for them. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that they don't work, in a sense, because what they do is they work to do something else. What they do is they distort the definition of what works in order to transform the very structures they're being applied to, in order actually to transform the very subjectivities, the very experiences of identity of those of us who are immersed in those situations. So they transform the structures, they transform subjectivities, generally in the direction of concentrating control and diluting, let's say in education, diluting critical thought. So from my point of view, so I'm just trying to track my stopwatch for just still going. That's good. So from my point of view, this looks very much like it is essentially another mode of privatization. It's an extension of, as I say, bureaucratic cruelty towards the most vulnerable. It really looks like algorithmic Thatcherism. And I do think that this generative AI is a massive bubble. It's built on foundational flaws. And even if you sort of look at the Wall Street Journal now or the Financial Times, even they are starting to get a bit nervous about that, for example, the valuation of NVIDIA and other parts of this giant, overly inflated market built entirely on systems that, as I say, don't really work. But the problem is that that's not really the point. It doesn't really matter if they don't really work. There's not going to be any accountability, because what is happening in the meantime, this is a shock doctrine. So under the guise of this crisis, just like the financial crash and entirely consistent with it, you can use this world-changing urgency to shift things further in the direction you want to shift without feasible sort of democratic opposition. And I think what we're seeing even more, and again, I tried to bring it out in the book, but the term that I'd now use for this aspect of things is microfascisms. So microfascisms is a word that I'm taking from Deleuze and Guattari, and what it's really talking about is those aspects of sort of interpersonal interaction and desire, as they would call it, the motivating forces that flow across our social spaces that aren't the obvious, that they aren't the explicit molar fascisms, right? They aren't the ones you can point to. They aren't the Rassemblement National or the AFD, whatever it is, but they are the aspects of our interactions, those everyday things that happen in small forms of social hierarchy or the power of any everyday interaction that build towards those much more recognizable fascisms. And to me, this is exactly what AI, unfortunately, is a condenser for. It absolutely concentrates and intensifies these long existing forces of microfascism that never went away. Microfascism is a permanent feature of this structure of society that we currently have. So it's no surprise that we see the reemergence of things like eugenics in both the narratives of effective altruism and the ideas of that these basically shitty AI products are good enough for the poor or good enough for the global south or whatever it is. At the same time as using AI to block any of those people from, like, say, people from the global south traveling anywhere else because of the AI-powered border regimes. So I was trying to emphasize this idea of necropolitics, which is an idea of politics that modifies the distribution of life chances through designations of relative disposability. And this is what we're seeing, obviously, in an extreme form in Gaza at the moment, where you have AI-powered targeting metrics through systems like Habsora, Lavender, and the others, that are essentially delivering a kind of rationalized logic for war crimes. And at the same time, this is a graphic from the actual Israeli Prime Minister's office plans for a future Gaza, right? This idea of a sort of continuous smart city that's going to be involved in sort of resource extraction and manufacturing electric vehicles and so on and so forth. And as I heard it said on the Trash Future podcast the other day, the fascist aesthetic of the modern times isn't jackboots or Hugo Boss anymore. It's this kind of AI-generated eco-modernism. And I think that ties into, Theo was talking about sort of false climate solutions. This is kind of fake eco-modernism, this fake green future, which is sort of fundamentally AI-generated, both visually and also in terms of how it's supposed to come about through AI. This is the vision of modern fascism, essentially. So how can we understand this ecologically in terms of relationships between organisms, environments, processes, interactions, and the distribution of energy and materials of the physical and material world? And I think the most obvious intervention, which has already come up, is the data centers themselves. These are the resource plundering cloud infrastructure forms that deplete whatever communities and ecologies they're in. This is actually an image of an activist called Rodrigo Vallejos, and this is a Quilicura district of Santiago. And those tanks behind him are actually the water. So he's smack bang connected with Theo's talk. These are these water tanks for the cooling, which is one of the most essential parts of data centers. These are drawing directly from the groundwater reserves of the city. So, Chile is particularly a focal point for this because they're undergoing basically decades-long drought at the moment, and yet the president has just signed into law another 28 data centers to be built around Santiago and the country more broadly under, even more dubiously, a free trade agreement. So anyone knows the history of free trade agreements, it's like a clear sort of alarm there. And the scale, and I'm going to come back to scale at the end of my talk. This idea of scale is key to these centers, more frequently called hyperscale data centers these days, because of the scale of the number of servers, number of processors, particularly because of generative AI, particularly because that's a step change in the requirement for computing and the requirement for these server centers. But it's not the scaling that they enable is across the domains. It's not just a physical scaling of computing resources, it's the scaling of what kind of ambition they can then have for social intervention. It's a scaling of what kind of vector they provide for venture capital. So it's really a scaling across multiple, if you like, conceptual domains, not just in terms of their size and their energy use and their water use. Although that is critical. Here's another example, which is proposed to be built not far from where I live in East London. This is in a place called in East Havering. And, this is a kind of idyllic scene. And I think that tells you that, firstly, that big tech understands data centers in a way as its Achilles heel. This is a point of vulnerability because there's a point of material instantiation. This is the bit you can actually see. This is the bit you can actually point to and say, that's why we can't build any houses in West London, because the entire electricity grid, this is true, by the way, the entire electricity grid is being committed to data centers. And yet AI is being presented as the solution to climate change, and yet it's being absorbed and ingested as the only thing that will solve climate problems. So it's this weird snake that eats its own tail in terms of being sort of clearly part of the problem, but projected as part of the solution. This particular data center actually presents the data center, which you can just about see as those buildings in the background, as a kind of collateral side effect of what's actually sort of a project to renew the wetlands and set up a kind of urban agritech farm, which just happens to use the heat generated by the data center. So, I mean, crazy fantasy stuff. So I just want to talk about conflict aspect of this. I mean, I've mentioned, the targeting AI in Gaza, but it's more broadly in the ecology of AI, the ecological aspects of AI are also conflict generating. Because of the intensity of the processing that's required for these models, there's an even more increased dependency on what's called conflict minerals and rare earth minerals that is most frequently come from contested places of conflict. And actually there's a new conflict itself arising around AI because it's this modern fantasy of control and power and of something that's become something geopolitical. There's actually a cold war between essentially the USA and China over AI itself, over the resources for the chips, over the who gets the machinery to design the chips. There's a thing called extreme ultraviolet lithography, which you need to make the very, very 5-nanometer architectures for these chips. And that require, because of the density of processing, it requires these rare earth minerals. And particularly on the left here, you've got coltan, which is a source of tantalum. So when I think about what is this ecologically, what I think about is the sort of patterns that this sets up and is part of. In this case, for example, you have to have tantalum for the capacitors on the GPUs. They are used to run many kinds of models, but including these models I referred to, these smart border models, in the case of Fortress Europe and the UK, keeping out the refugees. And those narratives about keeping out refugees are an important part of the rising far-right fascist narratives about which use the refugees as the other, the enemy, the invader. In the UK's case, this led to the commitment to deport refugees to Rwanda, for which the UK government paid the Rwanda government, whatever it was, £500 million, most of which seems to be somewhat untraceable. But coincidentally, the Rwandan government has found the money to refund a thing called the M23 militia, which is now invading the DRC using, full spectrum force, but particularly against civilians, uses rape as a weapon of war in its campaign to then seize the coltan mines, which are themselves the source of the tantalum. So you've got all of these dimensions of an ecology mutually reinforcing material, political, social, ecological relations, but that all reflect, I think, this kind of single one world apparatus. And what I try to do in the book, and what I try to continue to do more effectively, I suppose, is to position these connections as ontological entanglements. In other words, it's not just about the way that the environment is mixed up with the technical, is mixed up with the social, is mixed up with power relations, is mixed up with war. It's that these things are a particular version of the world, of all the phenomena that produce each other, that co-arise together. So what I'm proposing for that, and this is going a little bit slower than I hope, but hopefully we'll finish this last section relatively promptly, is this idea of decomputing. That's really what I wanted to get to today. What I wanted to talk about was the idea of establishing alternative forms of apparatus, and apparatus being that arrangement which produces these different dimensions, and that an alternative, a real alternative, as opposed to a sort of liberal reform or an ineffective reform in one or other area that doesn't take its entanglements into account. A real change, a non-reformist reform, if you like, has to be, in that sense, to me at least, a different kind of apparatus. And I'm proposing as a heuristic for that, as a kind of measure of that, this idea of decomputing, which is pretty much what it sounds like in a way, right? It's saying that there's a need for less computing. But the decomputing, really, what I mean by decomputing is kind of 50% degrowth and 50% decolonial. That's the D in decomputing. So what I'm saying is that AI, as Theo, I think, pretty much referred to, is certainly extractive and abstractive, but expansionist. It's essentially expansionist. It's like the underlying economy. It has to keep expanding. And in AI's case, it's that expansion is exponential. So AI is fundamentally expansionist. It's fundamentally, so this idea of acceleration and scale is AI's, or big tech's, particular version of the underlying sort of axiom of growth, which powers the sort of capitalist and neoliberal economy. So one way to tackle that is exactly to adopt a position of degrowth, degrowth in relation to computing. So that means a rejection of the fossil fuel dependency of computing, a rejection of the dependency on conflict minerals, a commitment to social production and ownership, a prioritizing of scaling down. This image, in case anyone's interested, from an artist called Martin Howes, Howse, who does some brilliant stuff around the connection of sort of the geophysical, human, and computing. And as I say, the other aspect that I'm trying to bring together under the heading of decomputing as degrowth and the decolonial. And I think we're acknowledging this idea of computing, or AI particularly, as we know it, as being part of this larger world apparatus, this reproduction of the ongoing imperial world system. Then what we need to do is stand against that, stand with the still surviving others to that, the other ways of relational understandings, the still surviving alternatives at the borderlines of modernity. This just happens to be something, again, that popped up last week. You can tell when I was preparing my slides, which is for a storage network, data storage network called Te Pā Tuatawata, which is developed according to the Maori principles of kota hitanga, which is collective benefit, and Ranga Tiratanga, which is self-determination. There's some really good stuff if you look it out in terms of some quite condensed work being done on applying Maori principles to the idea of data and computing. So decomputing, it rejects AI's infinite expansion, which is really just a version of the underlying economic. It rejects AI's propagation of a single worldview. It's very much about rejecting the view from above. This is really a theme that I was looking at in the book and sort of coming back to now, rejecting this top-down singular view of the world and really embracing as an alternative form of computing, ideas unknowability and unpredictability. And these were actually principles that were being explored and played with by people like the early British cyberneticists that have been long sidelined. So decomputing is trying to take this idea, which is an extant idea, of computing within limits, but to take it to refer not just to the idea of limiting the computational machinery, but limiting the extractive and decolonial and colonial logics, limiting the Western knowledge system, limiting the technological solutionism, and understanding the limits of the biosphere as a broadened ontological critique of what we currently call computing, and the idea of invoking something different, invoking something that can be possibly a helpful logic for resisting data centers as a way of cutting through their climate washing bullshit, but as a way of broadening those resistances, as a rationale to more collective struggles, to collective action. This one is, actually what I'm thinking of is the Courant Institute takeover in May 1970, when students kidnapped the New York University's CDC 6600 mainframe. They occupied the computer center and demanded that a ransom be paid to the Black Panther Defense Fund, the Black Panther 2021, who were on trial at the time. This is actually a picture from a different occupation from the University of Pittsburgh a year before. This is from their Black Action Society magazine, showing their takeover of their university computer center. So what I'm trying to say is that there have, in the same way that there are now campus occupations about the war crimes in Gaza, there is a history of an understanding of the criticality of computing infrastructure to the necropolitical activity of the current world system, and the idea that in itself is an important point of opposition, an important point of action. I mean, even as, well, speaking for myself here, even as academics and teachers, I think decomputing could be an idea to help inform our resistance to these absolutely shoddy substitutions for real pedagogy that are being propagated by AI's automatization and AI's normativity. So for me, decomputing is the reassertion of the relational over abstraction. And also, and this I think particularly echoes some of Theo's points, this idea of the vernacular, which is really a term I picked up off Ivan Illich, like many other things I picked up off Ivan Illich. But what the vernacular means is it's the other of scale. It's the forms of living that presuppose not externally imposed, but presuppose collectively formed limits to things like limits to property, limits to technology, and in the end, limits to scarcity. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much.